Welcome back. This is the Willingness video lesson. Scott Peck said, all adults who are mentally healthy submit themselves one way or another to something higher than themselves, be it God or truth or love or some other ideal. So he goes on to explain that the more we ignore truth, the more unhealthy we become. He explained that those who become what he calls evil or people of the lie, because he said the lie is designed not so much to deceive others as to deceive themselves. They cannot or will not tolerate the pain of self-reproach. This idea of willingness is so critical to the MDM Academy because we're asking you to make some big changes. We're asking you to think differently. We're asking you to admit your faults. We're asking you to look honestly at how you've created some of the pain that you see around you, and in order to empower you to make those things different forever moving forward. But you have to be willing. If you've ever been through addiction recovery, you know how hard and painful it really is, and willingness is the key to making it work. This is echoed over and over and over again in Alcoholics Anonymous, where the authors continue to show that those that are willing submit to the 12 steps always overcome their addiction, and those who cut corners or won't submit in some way don't. They wrote the book when they had 100 people sober, and it's one of my very favorite books in the world. I would recommend everybody to get it and buy it. But one of the things that they say specifically early on is there were some that didn't heal. There were some that didn't become sober. And we don't know if it was a mental illness or what it was, but they were just fundamentally unwilling to do the steps. Those that were willing always healed. Now, M. Scott Peck goes on when he's talking about evil. He says, Erich Fromm called evil malignant narcissism. Malignant narcissism is characterized by an unsubmitted will. In summary, to a greater or lesser degree, as we said before, all mentally healthy individuals submit themselves to the demands of their own conscience. Not so the evil, however. In the conflict between their guilt and their will, it is the guilt that must go and the will that must win. And I'm going to tell you some fascinating stories in a minute that really speak specifically to that element of the difference between the will and guilt. And we can tie this back again to will being our ability to choose, our willingness to love, to take action, to love ourselves and to love others. The reader will be struck by the extraordinary willfulness of evil people. They are men and women of obviously strong will, determined to have their own way. There is a remarkable power in the manner in which they attempt to control others. Indeed, it is almost tempting to think that the problem of evil lies in the will itself. Perhaps the evil are more inherently strong-willed, that it is impossible for them to ever submit their will. Yet I think it is characteristic of all great people that they are extremely strong-willed. So if we're tempted to say, oh, well, maybe people are evil or people of the lie, maybe people won't submit because their will is too strong, he says, no, that's just a characteristic of great people. Whether their greatness be for good or for evil, the strong will, the power and authority of Jesus radiates from the Gospels, just as Hitler's did from Mein Kampf. But Jesus' will was that of his Father, and Hitler's that of his own. The crucial distinction is between willingness and willfulness. So we can be very strong-willed individuals, and ideally maybe we are passionate and driven, but only in a willingness way. Willfulness always leads to self-destruction. Now I'm going to tell you the story of two great philosophers who are still widely read and have huge impact. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche is arguably the most read philosopher in America today on college campuses. So it's really important to recognize that these men's influence is continuing to reverberate and having an impact on future generations. And I want to tell you about their stories because they have so much in common. They were each born into Christianity. Each lost parents in childhood, which turned their lives upside down. Each was brilliant and educated in the Greek classics. Each studied for years and gained professorship at elite universities. They each had friendships with important men of their day. They each published influential works that are still read today. But one thing is completely different between these two men, and that is their willingness. Friedrich Nietzsche was said to be the most read philosopher in the West today. He was born in October 1844 in Prussia. At 20, he had this incredible education behind him, and he denounces theology with this statement. This is what he says to his sister. If you desire peace of soul and happiness, then believe. If you would be a disciple of truth, then inquire. And that was a phenomenal insight about him and who he was and where life led him, because he called himself a seeker of truth, and he questioned everything. He began then to reject God and Christianity and absolutes, and then he started building arguments for why there isn't a God. It's important to remember that very willful men and women who come out with brilliant arguments for God almost always reject God first and then build their arguments. It isn't the other way around. Now, they'll think about it a little bit and they'll tell you it's the other way around, but often they're very young, like Nietzsche was, and he had a lot of education still ahead of him. But he rejected God and theology, and here's the essence of his argument. He said, first of all, there haven't been histories written that show the day-to-day living of past peoples and their morals. In other words, we only have the writings of the kings and the queens, and we don't really know how everyday people lived, and we don't know what their moral code was. So when these kinds of histories are written, or when they're discovered, they are going to show that they're not going to show one consistent moral code, they're going to show many. Okay, this is critical because this is the foundation of his argument. And I think you can see already that it's very faulty. Many people buy into it and are duped by his argument. But essentially, if we could discover the evidence for my argument, then my argument would be true. And so it doesn't really work. And later on, we'll talk about how C.S. Lewis had the opposite experience in looking for morality in history and a consistent moral code. So 3, this means that there isn't a unity of morality throughout history. And C.S. Lewis said the opposite. We'll get to that in a minute. 4, being moral never benefits the individual but the people around him, which is why others praise him. So you and I aren't moral human beings because it benefits us. It's because other people like it, and we do it to get the praise of other people, and they encourage us to do it because it benefits them. Therefore, there's no real guilt because there are no true morals. We're only doing what the people around us tell us to do and praise us for. So nobody's really doing anything inherently good or bad. They're just doing what they get rewarded for. And therefore, there isn't really guilt because you didn't really do anything right or wrong. And since every society determines its own morals, morality and guilt are only the herd instinct. And this proves the weakness of the individual and the strength of the collective. And that the collective builds the morals, praises and the individual for living according to those morals and rewards them. The conclusion then is this: that God and religion are dead. If you've ever seen t-shirts or slogans or quotes, God is dead, Nietzsche, that's where it's coming from. This is his argument that God is dead, and it comes from a book that he wrote that we'll talk about in a minute, because they are not the true foundation of morality and they're no longer necessary. So morality never came from a God, and religion isn't necessary because we don't need morality. So the conclusion then is moral ideas are the simple result of human self-interest and the evolutionary urge to survive. So we want people to like us and we want people to praise us, so we do what they think is awesome, and then they do like us and praise us, and so that's our self-interest in morality. And then we're evolving, and so, this herd instinct, this societal morality helps us to survive. Now, this is the result, and this is what he wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and said, the conclusion is there's no God, God is dead. It's an awful yet exhilarating thought. Awful that God is dead because we feel abandoned by our former protector, yet exhilarating because suddenly our world opens to infinity. Anything now is imaginable. Our heart overflows with gratitude, astonishment, presentiment, expectation. At last, the horizon seems to us again free, even if it is not bright. At last our ships can put out again, no matter the danger. Every daring venture of knowledge is again permitted. The sea, our sea again is there, open before us. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea. For Nietzsche, the reason this is great news is not really because he ever really believed in God and knows he's dead, but because this gives society the permission, the intellectual permission to reevaluate the moral system and come up with something better. And for him, especially something better than traditional Christian moralities and its rules and its God. Because he doesn't like them and he doesn't want to be bound by them because he's such a willful person. He wants to make up his own rules. He doesn't like natural law. He doesn't like that there's principles. He doesn't like that there's something higher than him. He wants to be the highest entity. And of course, this puts him on the top of the pile because he's the one that figured it out. So he's the one that gets to start creating the new morality. And we'll see in a minute what that does for him. He goes on to explain that the conscience is a recent development in human history, even though all of written human history that we have shows the same kind of human being that we are today, and it shows the reality of a conscience. He says, no, actually, it's recent. It came along with the development of social structure and lawmaking, and he says it's unhealthy for us to repress our instincts, and it makes us emotionally sick if we try to adhere to Christian morality. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was the definitive work where he made these moral statements to the world. And by the time he wrote this book and proclaimed that God was dead and there was no morality, his health was completely broken down and he resigned from teaching. Now, right after this, beginning in 1833 to 1888, so just 5 years, he produced 9 major works. And the Notes for Will to Power, which was published by his sister after his death. And there's several books through history that have been definitive books on the will and why we do what we do, what is the will for. And for him it was, we will to power. Human beings want to have power, which of course is his paradigm because he's so willful. These began with Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which carried this pronouncement, God is dead. And not only did he decide at 20 that there was no God and spend the rest of his life trying to prove it and justify it intellectually, he speaks several times in his books about resisting the urge to glean meaning from life or to think that nature must have been created or to give purpose to hard things we go through. He says we must push through the temptation to think that life is anything more than an accident and that there are any moral rules or values at all. He says he's resisted these temptations himself. His once good relationships with Wagner and other individuals crumbled when Wagner's music took a Christian and moral tone, and he was elevating, inspiring his listeners. His rejection of truth, of morality, God, and absolutes led him further and further away from everybody, even from his own true self. Lawrence Gain wrote a book about him called Intro to Nietzsche, and it's fascinating how it explains this whole downward spiral for Nietzsche. It says, in his final year of lucidity, Nietzsche completed 2 short works, Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. The latter is a sustained attack on the Christian ethic. In the foreword, Nietzsche remarks that its readers will require courage for the forbidden and new eyes for the most distant things. Its proposed subtitle was The Revaluation of All Values. There followed all of his major works attacking and redefining God and morality, and one of his last works was titled The Antichrist. He goes on to say, Nietzsche's letters to Brandes and Strindberg, these were a couple friends, acquaintances that he wrote to near the end of his lucidity at the close of 1888, frankly reveal the perilously megalomaniac state of his mind. Ecce Homo, meaning behold the man, the last book Nietzsche wrote in 1888, takes its title from Pilate's greeting to Jesus in his crown of thorns. Mankind can begin to have fresh hopes only now that I have lived, he wrote. And in a letter to Strindberg, he wrote, I am to be the new savior, wrenching both history and humanity out of the grip of Christ. Remember when Erich Fromm talked about evil as malignant narcissism? He was actually becoming more and more evil and out of touch with reality the more and the longer he rejected reality, which is absolutes and true principles. When you don't live in harmony with any truth, when you spend all your time and energy trying to create your own truth, it can't but drive you insane and outside of reality. The book carrying the title is Nietzsche's autobiography. What better title for an autobiography than Behold the Man? It tells you exactly what's in it, a man that the book wants to show you. But it's also a famous praise uttered by Pontius Pilate. So Nietzsche is comparing himself to Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Because Nietzsche sees himself as a sort of Messiah. He has come to save us from the prejudices of philosophers. Like the Nazarene who came and replaced the old laws of the book with a new one, do unto others, love thy neighbor and thy enemy, Nietzsche is also here to destroy the old laws or Christian morality and bring about new ones, the Nietzschean morality that goes beyond good and evil, which is another title of another one of his books, Beyond Good and Evil. And he is going to save mankind from Christian morality by giving them the intellectual freedom to pursue their own morality. And now that you understand a little bit better some of the essence of the books that he's written and some of the central messages, you can see why not only did it lead him into insanity, but it's also having such a terrible impact on our society today as people read his writings and intelligent men and women then take that information onto college campuses and teach it to the next generation that anything goes and they can create their own reality. And we see this increase in mental illness. We see this increase in depression and antidepressants, which we're going to talk about in a later lesson. And so there's definitely a connection here. It's not like mental illness is always brought on this way or isn't legitimate. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there is a cost to the kind of willful mindset that Nietzsche had. The unwillingness to submit to anything. He was alone. He had no friends. His sister had to care for him. And even though he talked about self-criticism, ultimately, he wanted to make all the rules. Now contrast this with the life of C.S. Lewis. He also rejected God around the same age as Nietzsche, as a young college student. He continued to study as Nietzsche did, but over time, his central core willingness to be self-critical and evaluate honestly with no agenda led him to the opposite conclusion. Eventually, he realized that his favorite stories were those with religious and moral undertones. The classical plays, mythology, and epic poetry were the ones that spoke to his soul and elevated him and that he returned to again and again. They were the themes that fed his soul and caused him to think more deeply about life and himself. There he learned lessons that seemed to inspire him and make him want to improve himself. Over the next few years, he became friends with other professors. They eventually became the group called the Inklings, which was a discussion group and a writers' club. He began to discuss his thoughts with his peers, and long, deep conversations with some of them, including Tolkien, helped him to analyze his thoughts and the writings of the greats. They were devout, some of them were devout Christians who helped him with the intellectual arguments that he struggled with. In his book, Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, he talks about this idea of joy that started out as a child and the kind of feeling and longing that it was. This desire for something else, for something more beyond this world. And the ache, it was an intense love, but it was an intense ache for something more. And it was that experience of joy that he had a handful of times, that he experienced in these great writings and in these conversations, that helped him eventually feel that God was reaching out to him, that there was a free choice available to him, but that he was given the opportunity to inquire more and perhaps to really get at the truth, to really discover for himself whether or not there really was a God. His dedication to the discovery of truth, his honest self-evaluation, and his need to comply himself to it were what led him eventually back to God and true principles. Most importantly, in his willingness to look honestly at the question of God and give in when he really knew the truth. He said the night that he accepted God as real, he knelt to pray and said, "That night I was probably the most reluctant convert to ever approach God." He didn't want to get on his knees. He didn't want there to be rules above him. He was just as smart as Nietzsche, had read all of the same works, had thought through all of the same issues. But when he knew that God was real, remember those temptations that Nietzsche had to find purpose in suffering, to look at something higher than himself, to evaluate those experiences of joy and in nature and the joy of relationships? Lewis was willing to look at those. Lewis was willing to be honest about those. And Nietzsche just dug his heels in deeper. C.S. Lewis later went on to write, "Those who know the Tao, immutable natural laws, which he talks about in one of his books, can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us whether we like it, whether we make it or not. I myself do not enjoy the society of small children. Because I speak from within the Tao or natural law, I recognize this as a defect in myself. He's supposed to enjoy the society of small children. He sees that as part of God's plan for his children, and he recognizes that there's something wrong with him, not with the law itself. He evaluated himself and strove to bring himself into compliance with the standard above him, with moral principles he didn't create but that he knew were true, and he gave in. He was willing." Both men continue to have widespread, profound societal influence. This is both of them near the end of their lives, within years of their deaths. One man died broken, sick, alone, and insane. One man died surrounded by loving friends. One man continues to lead people away from God, while the other continues to bring men to him. One was willing and one was willful. Lewis commented this way about Nietzsche's attempts to scrap the truth. "The morality of Nietzsche is a mere innovation, but the Nietzschean ethic can be accepted only if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error, and then to put ourselves in a position where we can find no ground for any value judgments at all." Ironically, the way Nietzsche wants to prove God is dead is through historical records that don't even exist. A perusal of actual historical documents and spiritual records tells another story, which Lewis brilliantly wrote about. He said, "In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, and about moral idealism rather than moral obedience. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a man of high ideals, because this might lead you to think that moral perfection was a private taste of his own, and that the rest of us are not called on to share it." So he's saying here that God knows, because he created us, what we need. And he created natural law in order to help us know how to run this human machine that we've been given. And idealism, moral idealism, is just obedience. It's recognizing that there is that law is above you, and that it's your job to just learn it and obey it. He says, "The thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law or traditional morality or the first principles or practical reason or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory." And he again is referencing Nietzsche here and his efforts. "There has never been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems, or they now call them ideologies, all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole and then swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao and to it alone such validity as they possess." What is he saying here? He's talking about things like tolerance. Tolerance is a value. It's not the only value, and it's not the highest value. But as soon as we wrench it out of the Tao or out of natural law, and we say that it's more important than other things, it's more important than loyalty to a spouse, then we are trying to swell one part of the Tao, one part of the natural law, as more important than the rest of it. The only reason that we even think that tolerance is important is because we have this sense of natural law as a whole. He goes on, the rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. The human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed of creating a new sun, a new sky for it to move in. This is why he put together a small appendix at the back of The Abolition of Man called An Illustration of the Tao, to show the unity of truth throughout history and civilizations. Now, I've mentioned this Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote a couple times. Truth is never sweet, it is almost invariably bitter. And this is C. Terry Warner. When people obtain their own independent understanding of the truth, they can go beyond what they've been taught. If a price must be paid to obtain that understanding, then a teacher who cares will not deprive the student of the opportunity to pay that price by making the way forward seem easier than it is. And that is my point here. What you're going to do and what you are doing in this academy is hard, and it's going to feel hard. And if I'm a good teacher, if this program is centered around truth, it will be hard, and we won't deprive you of the price that you must pay in order to move forward and attain the personal growth that you want to obtain. It reminds me of an experience that I had in college. One day I had a friend approach me. We were having a conversation, and I said something, and it made her really angry. And she started yelling at me, and she told me that she couldn't stand me because I was so sarcastic, and that I was always hurting people with my sarcasm. And then she marched out. And I didn't know if she was ever going to be my friend again. And it stung. And I was really mad for quite a while that she had said those things to me and been so mean and swore at me and yelled at me. But the longer I thought about it and considered it, the more I realized she was right. The truth stung. It was bitter. But it was true. And when I was honest, I had to admit that my family was used to being very sarcastic, and that my siblings and even my parents had sometimes done the same to me, and that it did hurt, and that I hated it, and that I was turning around and doing it to other people, and that sarcasm hurts, and that I shouldn't be that way anymore. And so I went to her, and I apologized sincerely, and I've worked ever since then to not be sarcastic and to not carry that sarcasm into my own family and not allow that to be something that happens in my family with my children and my husband, and that I don't hurt others and they don't hurt each other through sarcasm. Because when we're faced with the truth about ourselves, it hurts. But as we take responsibility for it, and we'll talk about this more in a future lesson, we are empowered to fix it. The Bhagavad Gita says, "Evil is intellect, which wrapped in gloom, looks upon wrong as right, and sees all things contrariwise of truth." As you read through great religious traditions, you find, as C.S. Lewis did, this unity of truth and this unity of ideas. Here again is the unity of idea in a completely different culture and a completely different worldview and religion. That evil is when you turn right and wrong upside down, and you try to make what's right seem wrong and what's wrong seem right. And it's a gloomy way to live, and it's an unhealthy way to live. Remember that Peck explained that we're either willful or willing, submitting or unsubmitting. We either seek for truth and strive to live it, or we live in ignorance and pain, and problems persist. Ultimately, we will have to submit to one or the other. He says, there are only two states of being, submission to God and goodness, or the refusal to submit to anything beyond one's own will, which refusal automatically enslaves one to the forces of evil. We must ultimately belong either to God or the devil. This paradox was, of course, expressed by Christ when he said, "Whoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it."